these. Oh, okay. So yeah, I'll just get back to it. So what is machine learning is the first thing we do. So in traditional programming paradigm, as I said, we feed in the rules, we feed in the data as input, and we feed in some rules or some operations to perform on this data. And what we get is the answers or like the desired output from that data. So what machine learning does is it sort of flips this graph around, and we as users, we provide the data and the answers. Instead of providing the rules, we provide the answers, and the program, the machine learning program or the machine learning algorithm, what it does is it learns rules to sort of map these inputs to the outputs. So that's what that is what the machine learning does, and that's how it's different from your traditional programming paradigm. So I think we go to the next slide. So yeah, what is machine learning in a textual definition? It is the science of programming computers so that they can learn from data. Yeah, also thanks, Vidya. If you have any questions, you can always feel free to put it in the chat box, and one of our members will get to your question. So yeah, so machine learning is the science of programming computers so that they learn from data. In a more informal sense, it is this field of study that gives computers the ability to learn without being explicitly programmed. Okay, so for the next few slides, I'll be taking the example of computer vision. So basically, what computer vision is given an image. Basically, an image classification problem is where you give an image, and basically there is some sort of data or some sort of relevant output associated with that image. So in the case of number classification, where you give an input image as a number, as an image of a number, what you would expect to get is the output as the number itself, like is it 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or so on. So in the case of image classification, we don't, for each example that we have, for each image that we have, we don't explicitly program it that this image corresponds to the number 1 and this image corresponds to the number 2. And we don't write the program for each individual test case. So what machine learning does is, without being explicitly programmed to recognize these numbers, these images as these specific numbers, it learns basically how to map these images to these numbers. And that is something we'll be getting into in the next few slides. So a more formal definition is, so as you can see, what learning is in terms of a computer learning something. A computer program is said to learn from experience E with respect to some task T and some performance measure P, if its performance on that task T as a measure of P improves with experience E. So this is a bit confusing to read at the first time. So I'll get into like the details of each line here. So in the case, I'll take it with an example. So in the case of our image classification problem, the experience E is basically each image that it classifies, or each image that it learns to classify. So basically, as it goes through more and more images, as it learns more and more about how each image corresponds to each label or each value. The task here is image classification, obviously. And so as it gains more and more experience, its performance measure should be increasing. So its performance should improve with more and more experience. So yeah, I forgot to mention one thing, that in the previous slide, when we say that we give data and we give input, we give the data and the answers, and we get the sort of rules. That is what is known as supervised learning. So that is one field of machine learning, which is supervised learning, where you give it the input and the outputs, and it basically finds the rules or the relation between that data. There are other forms of machine learning like unsupervised learning and reinforcement learning. We won't get into that, but yeah, so basically the reason why we give inputs and outputs and expect it to find rules is, as humans also, when you are recognizing numbers for the first time, you will learn based on what you've seen and what you've been told is that number. So for example, if you see the number 8 and someone tells you it's the number 8, now you know, like, this is what number 8 looks like. And if you see somebody else's handwriting of the number 8, you basically know that if you see two loops, one on top of the other, that is the number 8. So initially you have to have some experience or some sort of understanding of what the 8 actually is. And so you learn from there, and then you can sort of apply that to different examples. So the same goes for a computer, where initially the computer knows nothing about what an 8 looks like. And you provided these labeled data. So you provided this image and you said, this is the number 8. You should learn what the number 8 looks like. And so then it sort of learns about what number 8 looks like. And when you give it another example of 8, it would probably be able to more accurately predict that the number that you've shown is 8. So I think you go to the next slide. So yeah, supervised learning, there are a few key points that I'll talk about here. So inputs, I'll take again the example of our image classification. Inputs will be the image that we have. So these are the inputs that we're providing to the machine learning program or the machine learning algorithm. The outputs of the target variable that we have is the actual label that it corresponds to. So as I said, we need to provide these labels so that it can, first of all, it can learn like what these images are supposed to correspond to. So these are the target variables that we have. So each image is associated with a label when you're training your model. So when you're training your model, it is basically learning from whatever inputs and outputs you provide. And when you are testing it, is basically when you provide an image and you expect it to provide some output, and that will most likely correspond to the actual label that it is. So inputs and outputs are basically the image and the label. So the weights are the parameters. So basically your input function, so your output function, or like what your machine learning model is supposed to predict, it is a function. You can think of it as a function of your inputs and the weights. So in machine learning, we usually represent inputs with X, we represent outputs with Y, we represent weights with either theta or W. I'll take it for W. I'll take it as W in this case. So your what your machine learning model predicts is a function of X and W. So this function of X and W will basically provide some sort of value that should be as close as possible to your actual target variable. So the value of the function f of X and W, that is your hypothesis. That is what your model is hypothesizing, or that's what your model is predicting. So this prediction, we want it to be as accurate as possible to the actual label. So if you remember, like when we said that formal definition of machine learning, it has to improve performance with more experience gained. So now we know what the task is, we know what the experience is, but we haven't really defined a performance metric. We haven't really defined like how we are measuring this performance. And so this performance is measured with what we call a loss function. So a loss function is basically, in the case I'll be showing later, it is basically we're trying to see how far off is my prediction from the actual value. So we want our prediction to be as close as possible to the actual value, right? So our loss function is basically just seeing how far off is my hypothesis from my actual target variable. So that is a loss function for one particular one particular image or one particular example or one particular input value. So the cost function is basically an average of that. So basically what we're trying to see with the cost function is, on an average, how far is my hypothesis from my actual target variable. So that will give you an average of like how good or bad your model is doing, or how good or bad your program is doing, how good or bad it is able to recognize these images, and how closely is it related to the actual value of what it's supposed to be. So this cost function is the average over all the training examples. So this is the function we're going to try to minimize. So if you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so we're going to take a little bit of an easier example, something that's easier to understand. So we won't go to image classification just yet. So if you can see this, I was given like just a list of numbers. So my inputs will be my X values, my outputs will be my Y values. So this is just a function, just an X to Y mapping, right? So if you can see this, -1 corresponds to -1, 0 corresponds to 2, 1 corresponds to 5, and so on. So this is, I mean, it's very simple to see. Like if you think of it as a y equals to mx plus c sort of equation, I mean, you've obviously you've done this before in like grade 11 and 12, where you basically just put the value of 0 into your y equals to mx plus c function. You find the value of c, which is in this case 2. And then basically you just, for any example, you take the x values and y values and you find the value of m. So if you can see, the relation here is y equals to 3x plus 2. So if you provide this to a machine learning model, we will take the weights as W0 and W1, which will basically correspond to the C and the M values in your y equals to mx plus c function. So the hypothesis that we want to make is going to be the function of our weights and our input variable. So if you can see, the hypothesis I've written is W0 plus W1x. So this is the same as y equals to mx plus c. So mx plus c is the line, right? Is the line that we are sort of trying to fit. So what we want to happen is we want this line to correspond as accurately to our actual output variables. So the 1, the -1, 2, 5, 8, 11, 14, these are our output variables. And we want our function to map as closely as possible to these values, these y values. So right now, we the only things that we can change, the only things that our model can learn are the weights, W0 and W1, because the inputs and outputs should not be modified. So when we learn, basically we learn by modifying these weights in a certain manner. So the loss function that I had mentioned earlier is a metric of how close your hypothesis is to your actual label, right? And so we can see that the if you take the difference of it, if you take the difference of the actual value and the hypothesis, that will basically give you like how close or far it is. So if it's a closer value, the value will be closer to 0, and if it's like sort of a greater difference, that will be like high. But and so in order to account for negative values, we take the square. So this is basically just finding the distance of a point to that line that we are measuring, W0 plus W1x. And then that half, that 1/2, is just added for convenience of differentiation that we'll see up in the next few slides. And the cost function is you're going to be your loss function, the same thing, the loss function, just summed over all the possible input variables. So basically, yeah, so for each, the weights that we have are randomly initialized. So the initial line that we get, W0 plus W1x, would be a random line. We don't know how well that is fitting to these points. And so when you get your loss function initially, it will be pretty high because the distance of each point to that line will be very high because it's a randomly initialized line. So what we want to do is we want to minimize this cost function. And the way we minimize it is through gradient descent. So if you go to the next slide. So gradient descent is an iterative approach to finding the optimal weights. So what our objective is here is to minimize the cost function, right? And so if you remember from class 12 calculus, the way you minimize a function is to basically find the derivative of that function and find the point the slope is 0. That will be a critical point, right? And that critical point will usually be like either the maxima or the minima. And so that is the same thing is what we apply in machine learning for gradient descent is we use these partial derivatives to calculate the minima. So what we do is we compute the cost function, and the cost function is what you want to minimize, right? So in our case, we have only two parameters, which are W0 and W1. So for each parameter, we want to find the slope. So the partial derivative, what it calculates is a slope, right, at a particular point. And the point where it is minimum will have slope 0. So at a point W0, W1, the slope will tell us sort of which direction has the highest increase value. So in which direction, if you go in which direction, will you get the highest increase of that function? So what we want to do is want to decrease that function. So if we take the negative value of that slope, we find the direction where it is decreases the fastest. So then what we do is we update the parameters and then we repeat the same function over and over again. So we'll have a visualization of this in the next few slides. So you can just go to the next slide. And yeah, so there's a little bit of math behind gradient descent, but this is something that you've definitely walked through in like 11th and 12th grade. There's a few changes here. The W's will be represented as thetas, as I had mentioned. The cost function will be J of theta, and the hypothesis will be H of X, which is a function of theta and X, right? So if you can see the second line of the equation here, this is our cost function that we had defined, right? The loss function is just the square of the hypothesis minus the actual label, and then we divide by 1/2. The cost function is the sum over all of that, is the average, right? So we just sum over 1/m, and then we have this m in the denominator outside, right? So what we want to do is we want to take the partial derivative with respect to theta. So theta can be, in our case, it can be like either theta 0 or theta 1. So the way we take derivatives, I'm sure you all know, is 1/2m is a constant, so that will be taken outside. And this is h theta of x minus yi square. we're taking derivative with respect to theta. So this square will become 2 times of this hypothesis minus yi. And that's why we have the 2, because this 2 that we get from the exponent, that will be cancelled out by the 2 in the denominator there. So we have the 2's over there, and then we take the partial derivative with respect to thetas and y's. So the thing about the hypothesis function is that it is basically a sum of thetas and i's. So that is theta 0 x0 plus theta 1 x1. If you take x0 as 1, then it will be theta 0 plus theta 1 x, which is basically what we had in our hypothesis function, right? And so when we're taking partial derivatives with respect to any theta, there is only one term which has that theta I as the coefficient, right? Because it's theta 0 plus theta 1 x plus, I guess it will be theta 2 x2 and so on. But in our case, only theta 0 plus theta 1 x. And so when you take the derivative of this, yi is obviously a constant, so that will be derivative as 0. And for every other term which does not have the theta I as a coefficient, those will also be taken as constants with respect to theta I, and those will also be equated to 0. And the only term which will have theta I as the coefficient, the only thing that will be left over after differentiation is the xi. So as you can see, the final equation will be the hypothesis minus y into some xi. So if you just plug in this value into the partial derivative at the top, the very first equation, you can see that it will be theta j minus alpha by m of this whole thing. This is the partial derivative. You take minus because you want to go in the opposite direction of the slope. So everything over here we've talked about except for the learning rate, which is alpha. So the learning rate basically defines, the learning rate defines how big of a step you take. So if you go to the next slide, when we're talking about moving towards the optimum solution, we have to take steps, like maybe we have to take steps in order to sort of update your parameters as it reaches the optimal value. So the size of these steps that we take are defined by the learning rate. So if you consider a cost function with only one parameter, theta, the cost function is a squared function, right? So it will be a parabolic sort of parabolic function. So as you can see, there's obviously a minima to this parabolic function. And if you take alpha as a smaller value, then the steps that you take or the updates that you make to your parameter at each iteration, that will be very small. And basically it will take many tries, many sort of updates to reach the optimal value. And so that is not optimal because that will take a lot of time to reach the minimum point. Conversely, if it's very high, if the learning rate is very high, then that would also not be sort of good, because what might happen is you might overshoot your minimum value. So if the alpha is too high, what might happen, instead of going to the minimum value, you might overshoot it to some other higher point in the parabola where the slope would be even higher, the magnitude of the slope. The signs will alternate between the left and right side of the minimum. Any point to the right of the minimum will have a positive slope, any point to the left of the minimum will have a negative slope. So at every iteration, when you update it, it will keep on going higher and higher and higher, and basically you will never reach the minimum point. Your function will keep diverging and you would never find that minimum. So you want to find a value of alpha that is just right, so that like you find the optimal value correctly. So that is something that you as a user can tune and tweak. So you can go to the next slide. So yeah, this is just a visualization for a single parameter equation again, like I said. So this will be y equal to an mx sort of line. So at every point, we can see that the dotted line on the left side will be the derivative of that point, the derivative at that point p of the cost function. And the cost function is obviously a squared function of the parameter, right? Because it is the hypothesis minus y squared. So that will be a parabolic curve. And the parabolic curve will obviously have a minimum somewhere. And so at every point, we find the slope, and then we move in the direction of that slope. So we can see at every iteration that black dot is going closer and closer and closer towards the minimum value. And at the same time, the value of p that we get from moving this the thing towards the minimum value, as we update our parameter towards the minimum value, you can see that the line is fitting better and better to these points. So this is what is known as linear regression. We won't get into what linear regression is exactly, but if I had to sum it up, it's just basically fitting a line to these points such that the distance of each point from the line is minimum. So yeah, this is for a y equal to mx curve, but in our case, we had two parameters, w0 and w1. So if you go to the next slide, yeah. So if you guys have finished your engineering mathematics 1 course, the calculus course in your first semester, I think, you can see that like this is a contour curve. This is basically sort of a three-dimensional figure where we have two parameters. We have, in this case, it's m and t, but for us it will be w0 and w1. And the cost function will be a sort of a bowl-like function here with a minimum somewhere. As you can see, that purple region will be the minimum. So initially our weights are randomly initialized, so it might be somewhere at that corner, as you can see the first red dot. But at every iteration, we basically find the slope with respect to m and with respect to b. And at each iteration, we move closer and closer towards that minimum. And as you can see, as we update the parameters m and b, our line is fitting better and better to the set of points here. So you can see the distance between the points and the line is decreasing. So in our case, the line would be our prediction and or the hypothesis, and the points would be the actual target variables. And so we want to minimize the distance between the point and the line, which is basically to reduce that squared function. So um, yeah, we can see that the as we minimize that and as we get to that minimum value on the left side, the right side graph is fitting best to the put it in the chat box, or I think we can move on to neural networks. I think you can go to the next slide. Yeah.
Right. So if you guys have any questions, you guys can put it up in the chat. We'll go ahead with the introduction to neural networks. So, right, I guess you can just stay on the previous slide for now. Yeah. So, neural networks, as they are a very important, aspect for machine learning and deep learning things. So when you look at the name neural networks, you can see that it has something to do with or something in relation to basically our brains and all that. So the word neural, right? It takes in the neural networks kind of takes inspiration from how we have like nerve cells in our brain which are interconnected, and they send like electrical impulses, and gradually, like according to those impulses, we tend to do stuff. So so researchers took this idea of how the brain works and uh, defined this structure called neural networks. Right. So neural network. You can go to the next slide. Yeah. So neural networks are again like a means of doing machine learning, where a computer, by analyzing training examples and certain inputs, it learns to perform a task or give you a result in the end. So when you look at a neural network, right, it consists of maybe like thousands or even millions of very simple processing nodes, which are aptly called neurons, taking again inspiration from how like the brain works and all that, which are densely interconnected. Right. So this is basically what a neural network is in general. So if you could go to the next slide. Yeah. So if I just have an image of how you can correlate with the biological neuron to an artificial neuron. You guys don't have to worry about the biology part for now, and I mean it doesn't really have anything true here, but like how it functions is the way it functions, as I said, is an inspiration for the artificial neuron. So you get a certain impulse into the neuron, which if you correlate with your artificial neurons is a set of inputs, right? And according to those inputs, you get an output accordingly. So like an output impulse in the biology neuron, and in an artificial neuron, you get a certain output. Could you go to the next slide? Yeah. So if you look at how a neuron is, you have a set of inputs, say from x1 to xn and so on. And now these are connected to one neuron. Right. So what we do in the neuron is basically take the weighted sum of the inputs. So why weighted or something like that? So your inputs are essentially like certain features or something like that. So maybe some features, say some inputs, say x1 to x3 or x4 or something, may have a higher impact on your intended result and all that. So you can give them a higher weight, and accordingly, like the what do you say, the other neurons may have like a lesser of an impact on the output, so they'll be given lower weights, and you just take the sum of all you just take the sum of the weighted sum of these inputs, and then you also add a certain bias term to it, which sort of is like, if you look at it in a uh, like the meaning of bias and all that, it sort of pushes you the neuron to work in one particular direction or so on. And that sum of weighted sum of inputs along with the bias is passed through an activation function, which I'll go in a little depth later on, and you get the corresponding output. So you have your inputs x1 to xn, and you calculate the weighted sum of these inputs along with the bias, and then corresponding output is given, and it's passed through the activation function, and it is outputted. So if you could go to the next slide. Right, okay. So if you look, this is basically like a structure of a neural network. You have various neurons which are basically interconnected, and then you have your output in the end. So when you look at the structure of a neural network, right, so you typically have your input layer, which is all that variable 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And then you have the output layer, which is the classification. So the last three inputs in the end, and you have some layers in the middle which are called hidden layers. These hidden layers, they try to basically do some computations in order to give you the result that is needed. So if you look carefully at the GIF over there, you can see that some neurons are like, a bit of a lighter green in color, and some neurons are more darker in color and so on. So this is where you see the activation function playing a big role. You can, I guess, like think of it as a function that tries to tell how activated should a particular neuron be. If it is more activated, basically it kind of has a slightly higher impact on the output, and if it is lesser what do you say, activated, it doesn't do really much of an impact. So if you could, like, that is basically what an activation function is. If you could go to the next slide. Yeah, so activation functions are like a textual like definition of activation functions. They're basically functions that decide which neurons will push forward the values to the next layer. So the neural network that we just saw, you can they're called as feed forward neural networks, because the direction of uh, traversal is just like only forward, and there's no like backward traversal and all. So that is the function of that is basically what an activation function does. It decides which neuron will be more activated, and it will hence contribute more towards the output and so on. So you have various types of activation functions. Could you go to the next slide? I have put out list like the common activation functions that are like, I mean, apart, maybe you can ignore the linear function, which is not very not used in as an activation function, but like you have the sigmoid, the tanh function, and the ReLU function, especially the ReLU function, which is sort of used very frequently in neural networks. So I said, like, linear functions are not typically used as activation functions. This is because, like, if you look at real world data or real world inputs, right, it is not like very linear. You don't have like a linear relationship. You can't just do a y is equal to mx plus c graph and try to, get a very good relation between things. And like you have a lot of non-linearity in real life as we speak. So to add some non-linearity into your neural networks, we use the functions such as tanh, sigmoid, and ReLU. Even though ReLU is basically rectified linear unit, that is the full form of ReLU. For those of you who wanted to know that, even though if you look at it, there's like a linear line, it is still something that is non-linear, because for negative inputs, the value is 0, and the positive inputs, it is equal to the input itself. So if you look at the functions, I'll start off with sigmoid. So like a sigmoid function is as the like the function definition is given out there. So what it basically does is it takes a set of input, say x, and then it basically squishes that x into a range from 0 to 1 based on the definition that is given there. So the value of the sigmoid function is always going to be from the range 0 to 1, and it sort of has some non-linearity. As we need some non-linearity in our model, we use nonlinear functions. But if you look at the sigmoid function, it is not. There are some issues when you try to use the sigmoid function as an activation function. If you look at the sigmoid function at, say, the higher values of x, right, when x keeps increasing, you see that it kind of, the increase in the function value sort of is very small, right? The increase between x and x minus 1, from x minus 1 to x, is sort of very small for higher values of x, and lower, even when you go towards the other end of x, it sort of decreases very slowly. This sort of leads to a problem which is known as the it's called the vanishing gradient problem. There's a term for it. Uh, so basically, what, like, I'll just give a general overview of why it is a problem. It doesn't. It just doesn't like help in the model to learn better or so on, because the change is very small. It sort of like stops learning after a point of time. When you look at very complex applications of neural networks, you tend to have like a lot of layers in between. So this kind of after a point of time, it just stops learning any further, and like you need some amount of learning in order to tune your weights and biases and so on. So sigmoid function is not used there, not very effective. It has its issues. Then you have the tanh function. Tanh function, again, it is quite similar to sigmoid function, except for the fact that the range is from -1 to 1 and so on. Again, this also suffers from the same vanishing gradient problem that I was talking about. So that also has its issues. So to fix this particular issue, the ReLU function was introduced. As I said, the rectified linear unit. The function definition is given there, max of 0 to x. So it, like, as x increases, even the value of the function increases. So it sort of eliminates the issue of vanishing gradient and all that. And it is, due to its certain advantages, it is highly preferred the in making neural networks. One thing to note, it is not it is not used in the input and output layers. Usually it is used in the hidden layers. So that is one thing. So these are the various activation functions that you have in a neural network. And to like sort of recap, a neural network takes some inputs and generates certain outputs. Each neuron takes like a weighted sum of inputs, and then it's passed through an activation function, which sort of gives you the required result and so on. Are there any questions before we go ahead? Is there any questions?
I'd like to add on a few points over here. From the figure, as you can see for tan h and sigmoid, as your x increases, you can see that the slope is going down towards 0. Now, this is the problem of your vanishing gradient. Gradient is nothing but a slope, and then it vanishes because it goes to 0. That's about it.
Yeah, so that is a point. Yeah, that's a good point. Are there any questions? If there are no questions, I guess we can go ahead with the next topic, which I guess is forward and backward propagation. Right.
So yeah. Okay, so what is forward and backward propagation? So as you saw the structure of the neural network, uh, we need to calculate the scores as such, like for making the classification. But then, like, how are the weights actually modified, and depending upon the loss, how we like use that to update our weights. So what happens in forward propagation is we move from the input layer and go up till the output layer, and we use the weights and biases as discussed before, and we try to make a score, like we try to predict the output. Okay, so at each neuron, what in the hidden or the output layer, uh, we process in two steps. There is the pre-activation and the activation. Pre-activation is where you calculate the value, like that's the sigma of your W into X, and you add a bias to it. And activation is where you feed it to the activation layer, like as we discussed before, and then get the activated output. So this has to be done at each neuron. So let us look at how it's done. Okay, so at each step, so if you can see over here, x1 and x2 are your two inputs, and the ones in the blue color are the neurons belonging to the hidden layer. So at each hidden layer, you calculate for each neuron the z, which is equal to the sigma of w into x plus the bias term, and then you feed it to the activation function, say f, and then you get the activated output. Okay, so at the end of it, what you have is the final output. Okay, so but then in this iteration, as we move from the input layer to output layer, we like as you can predict, the output that we generate won't be that good. So what we do is we try to compare it with the actual output that the model should have been given, and then we move from now we move from the output layer and towards the input layer, and in doing so what we do is we update the weights accordingly. So that is the process of backward propagation. Okay, so what we do is we try to compute the gradient of the loss function, okay, with respect to each weight, and then we take each layer at a time, and then we iterate backwards from the last layer to the first layer. So let's look at how that. Okay, so what happens is in the for forward propagation, you calculate the scores at each of these neurons, that is Z1, Z0, Z2, Z3, and then those scores are used further to calculate our final output, which is say h of x. But then now what we do is we try to compare the output that the model is giving with the actual output. So over here we try to compare h of x with the correct output y, and we will try to compute the loss. Okay, and then what we have to do is, as discussed before, our main objective is to try to minimize the loss function. So now we move in the backward direction. So in doing so, what we do is we compute the loss. Okay, say suppose delta 1 was the loss at this neuron, then what we try to do is we go backward a step, we consider this layer. Now, we try to compute the loss at this thing, and then we take the derivative of our cost function with respect to the value z that we computed at this layer. Okay, and then what we try to find is the derivative of the weights and the derivative of the bias. Actually, it's the derivative of the cost function with respect to the weights and with respect to b. So there's some math involved in it, and these are like the final equations that you will arrive at. We'll not go much into depth into how we arrive at it, but then just to get an intuition, what we do is we have now calculated the derivative of the cost function with respect to the weights and biases. So what we do now is we modify or update our weights accordingly. And thus now what we do is once this layer has been done, the Z layer, we move backward by another layer. And then this iteration continues. Like again we go like again we take up the forward propagation step with these updated weights, and then we do this continuously until our loss is minimized. So yeah, so this summarizes the whole process of forward and backward propagation. So over here you can see like we are feeding in X. We try to compute the activated output over here depending upon the parameters that have been initialized as of now. We move in the forward layer, and then we try to predict the output, say E of L. And then what we do is we compare it with the actual output that the model should have given. Okay, and then we compute the loss, and now we move in the backward direction. We use the loss over here, we use the weights and the bias that was initialized so far, and then we try to update the weights such that the loss is minimized, and then we move in the backward direction, and then again we go ahead with the forward propagation, and then this whole process is continued until the loss is minimized. So that was about it. So, yeah. So if you guys have any doubts, please feel free to ask.
Does anyone have any doubts? I'll take that as a no and I'll proceed. You can go to the next slide. So we finally come to CNNs. Now the 5 basic steps or layers that we'll be taking in CNNs are the convolution layer, activation function as Sudarshan explained, a pooling layer, padding, and then a fully connected layer. I'll be explaining each of these step by step. You can proceed to the next slide. Now over here you can see our input image on the left side and our output on the right side. And in the middle you can see our convolution filter. Now what is this doing over here? Initially you just go take a block of size 3 by 3. That's our filter size that we have defined. We can choose it to be anything else. There's no particular reason we have taken a 3 by 3 matrix. And what a filter does over here is you multiply each of the elements in the matrix and then sum them. That's what the operation is being shown in this image, like -1 into 3, 0 into 0, 1 into 1, and so on. Now, you have some technical terms that come over here. You may have heard of a stride for a filter. That will be written in the XY direction. X is basically horizontally and Y will be vertically. If you're taking a step of size 1 towards the X direction, now you're marked on 6 as your middle value of the matrix. If you take a stride in the direction of X as a value of 1, you'll be moving to 2. Now, if you define your complete convolution layer stride as 1, 1, how it will move is first you'll take that 3, 0, 1, 2, 6, 2, 2, 4, 1. That will be your first value that you apply your filter on. And the next one will be 0, 1, 5, 6, 2, 4, 4, 1, 0. You can visualize that as a box again. And then it will keep moving towards the right. After it reaches the last block, which is basically that 3030303141, you'll move down back to 301262241. That will be your next block. That's your stride size of 1 4 in the direction of y. Now over here, I've called this convolution filter as a Sobel filter. For a filter, you may have predefined filters that you're using in image processing, or you can initialize it randomly and then have your model learn it itself. I'll be explaining the difference between the two. You can go to the next slide. Over here, these are two common filters that you'll find in image processing. The first one you can see, what will this do? It will basically take the scale all of the elements by a factor of 1/9. This will reduce your image sharpness. And you can see I've written two matrices over here with horizontal and vertical written under them. As you can see, for the horizontal one, you can observe like a horizontal pattern on the first row and then the third row and a row of zeros in the middle. Now your filter size doesn't have to be 3 by 3 again. Depends on what you want to choose and what you think will be appropriate. It's basically like you can visualize it as the area of the number of pixels you're looking at. Like it's like your focus point. And in vertical, you can see an image similar pattern where you have taken a column of -1, -2, -1, which are non-zero values. In the middle, you have zeros, and you have a column filled with again non-zero values. These are used for horizontal and vertical edge detection. These are the standard filters that you'll find in image processing. They are also called convolutional filters, but they need not be the same thing that you'll be using in convolutional layers. I'll explain that. You can move to the next slide. Now, the difference that you'll see is you can initialize your filters in any random way. Like over here, you've seen that you've given some numbers. In a traditional convolutional layer, if I take it inside a CNN model, I won't be feeding in fixed values necessarily. I can initialize to any random value, and I'm not giving whatever the previous human tendencies. Like over here, I'm saying it's a horizontal edge or it's a vertical edge. These are fixed concepts. Like these are stuff that humans have thought about. Now, if we leave it up to the code to decide, update it based on backpropagation or other methods, you may find unique filters, like something that detects the corner of someone's eyes or hair or the edge of a human being. It can capture different shapes like this depending on your filter size. You can go back one slide. Over here, what you observe, I've taken a 3 by 3, 1 matrix. I say this as my number of channels is 1. If I'm talking about computer vision, if my channel is 1, that means I have a grayscale image. Grayscale meaning black or white. If I have a RGB image or something, I'll have 3 different channels, which is basically like you can imagine 3 duplicates. Like 3 duplicates of the matrix stacked behind each other. That's a good way of imagining it. And then your filter will also have 3 separate channels, or you can have the same filter applied across all the channels. You can move on. Are there any doubts regarding the convolution layer? I think I'll proceed. Now pooling. Why will we use pooling? Say, nowadays, if you see, you might have heard of 8K images, 12K images, and then these are very high resolution images. All the features that you need to identify may not be necessarily fit to just high resolution images. Say if I'm taking something like image detection, I want my model to work on poor quality of images also. One way of doing this is I can initially I can either pool the values of the matrix or I can downsample it. This is one of the methods. Over here you can see it's written as max pooling. What this has done is I've taken a filter of size 2 by 2. So basically I'm looking at 2 comma 2 9 4 first. What max does is it just takes the maximum of this. Another method of pooling I can do is average pooling, where I just take the average value of all these cells. Now again, as I mentioned, the stride is basically your jump in the direction of x comma y. If I say stride as 2 comma 2, so I'm, instead of moving one step in x, I'm moving 2 steps in x. That's why my 2 comma 2 9 4 is the current one, and the next one is 7 3 6 1. It's not 2 7 4 6. If I define my stride as 1 comma 2, it would go over here also. And then you can see in the direction of y over here, it's gone directly down. It skipped 9485 and gone to 8531 instead. Because I mentioned my stride size of y as 2. You can try out with higher values of stride as well. This depends on the model that you're using, and you can observe different results based on varying the parameters over here. Are there any doubts regarding this? Another reason why I might use pooling is I might want to look at a group of pixels together. Like if I have a high resolution image, then there might be like a group of say 4 or 16 pixels that don't contain much of the region of the image. Like it might contain one small dot, and I want to reduce that. You can move on to the next slide. Now padding. Why will I use padding? Normally you can see over here, this is what is called valid padding. Basically I do not have any extra padding over here. Okay. Can we use a 3x3 pooling filter on a 4x4 matrix? Yeah, you can use the 3x3 pooling filter on a 4x4 matrix, but you should make sure that your stride size is 1. Otherwise, there's no point in it. You'll just scale it down to just 1 pixel. And then you aren't really learning anything when you have just one number. This is something you can do, but it's not recommended. Alright, I should continue explaining padding. This is the method of calling, this is the valid padding. Over here, you can see that I do not have any extra values outside my input cell, outside my input matrix. That is basically how your model will normally work. What I can do is I can add extra zeros around the matrix. Now, why will that be helpful? As you can see, after I've applied the filter, my input size has gone down from 4x4 to 3x3. There may be instances where I don't want to reduce the size of my matrix. In that case, I'll have zeros or any other value that I choose, but the most common form of padding is zero padding. And if the size of the input matrix remains the same as the output matrix, that will be known as same padding. We can move on to the next slide. Now for this, just look at the end of the right end of the image. What is a fully connected layer? Over here, it's just represented by the green and the red dots. You can see each of the green dots is connected to all of the red dots. Now, this is called full connection. You can imagine it like a mesh network if you're familiar with computer networking. All of the dots are connected to each other. So why will I do this? Generally, after I perform the convolution, pooling, or padding, I'll flatten my matrix into a one-dimensional array. After I flatten it to a one-dimensional array, I train it using a traditional neural network that is sort of represented by a neural network. The fully connected layer is generally that you generally have fully connected layers before your output layers to learn more extra features regarding the numbers. Are there any doubts regarding this? I think we can proceed if that's all. Mudit, you can start presenting.
Are you still presenting or do I switch?
Yeah, I am done.
Oh, go to the previous slide once. Let me give some overview of it. So yeah, now we'll see something about architectures, like how all these you learned are integrated into one, and how are they applied or where are they applied. So there's this competition which is organized each year, named ImageNet. So it's about 15 million images are there, which are categorized around, I guess, 62,000 topics. So uh, they are categorized on 62,000 topics, and what we have to do is, like, there's two error categories. Like there's one top 5 error and there's one top 1 error. So all the images are categorized into top 5 variants, and if the neural network guesses only one of them, the we give them a pass. So yeah, this is the process of the you can say competition or something. So there were some architectures. The main development of CNNs, you can say, was inspired due to that competition itself. So yeah, there are some architectures which were introduced in that competition. So yeah, we can go ahead. uh, this is the VGG16 model. So this was gave in 2016. So what you can see is there's one 224 by 224 into 3 input, and the image is RGB image, as you can see. So this is passed to a layer of 224 by 224 into 64. This the first layer is convolution, and then it's passed through a ReLU layer. So basically, we apply activation functions so that the uh, image data, or we can have some non-linearity in the image data, because there's no use of any neural network parsing if there's no activation function, right? So the ReLU function is just an activation function, which is you can say creating some non-linearity in the feature so that our neural network can learn better. So then it's connected into a max pooling layer, which already is discussed here. And yeah, this is how VGG16 was declared. There was some key points here which kind of VGG16 gave, like this was the winner of the 2016 ImageNet competition. So this architecture, there are three fully connected layers which follow a stack of convolution layers. The first two have 4096 channel each. The third performs a 1000-way classification, thus containing 1000 channels. So all hidden layers are equipped with ReLU nonlinearity. So yeah, it's pretty much like there are two major drawbacks here. First is it's painfully slow to train. Like you can see, there are, say, suppose thousands, and you can say it's the number of parameters are in 10 to the power 4 into 10 to the power 2. That accounts to almost 10 to the power 8 parameters. So it's painfully slow to train, and the network architecture weights themselves are quite large. So yeah, to rectify this, we can go to the next slide. This was the AlexNet architecture, which was proposed by Alexander. So, according to this, the main highlights of this paper are it used ReLU instead of 10H to add nonlinearity. So, previously, before AlexNet, people used to use 10H in a significant amount of models. People didn't consider ReLU as a proper, you can say, activation function. They all argued its correctability. But if this model used ReLU instead of 10H, and this added 6 times the speed reduction to the normal accuracy. Also, the main feature here is it used dropout as the. Have you all guys discussed about dropout before? Do they know of dropout before?
I don't think it's been explained. I think like you could probably take like
Yeah, I'll
basically
give
what it
over.
is.
I'll give an overview. So dropout is basically a regularization feature. So previously, what we used to do is we normalize all the values so that the calculation don't become too much, and we the calculations keep on some subpar levels so that they don't go to infinity when multiplying by multiplying. So what dropout here is, it adds a probability feature to all the layers. Like there are 2048 layers in the final layer. So what dropout will do here is it adds a probability feature, like each node has a probability of, say, suppose C percentage to go to the dense layer. So this adds quite a non-linearity feature, because yeah, it's pretty helpful to go use as a regulation feature to deal with overfitting and all. So yeah, this is pretty much it's the same thing. There's convolution layer, there's max pooling layer, there's again convolution, and there's again max pooling, and then it's connected to a lens layer. So yeah, we can go ahead. Guys, do you have any doubt here? Okay, so we can go ahead. Next, here we'll talk about application of CNN. So yeah, why or what we learned are used and how they are used. So the problem given is, given an image, detect each instance of a set of semantic categories. Go to the next slide. Play this video. You can see here it's a live video feed where the squares are made around the objects, and it's trying to recognize what's in that square. Yeah, that's pretty much. We can go to the next slide. Hope you got an idea of what we are doing, what our object detection problem is. So yeah, this uses a model called YOLO. YOLO is basically a model short formed as You Only Look Once. It's a popular real-time detector. It's the same architecture as we've seen yet. The first layer is convolution layer. It's connected to Maxwell layer. Then it's convolution layer connected to Maxwell layer, and at last connected to a neural network component. We can go ahead. So there's one key thing it's doing, like one key thing what YOLO is based on. It applies a S by S grid on input image and tries to make a bounding box around all the objects which are given, and tries to calculate a confidence between them. What confidence does here? It tries to see from the data set which it is on trained here, and tries to detect if there's any pattern which we saw before. So as you can see the class probability map, there's a probability of all the classes which were previously we saw in the dataset when it was built. So as you can see in the final image, the final detections, there's this square on dog, there's this square on cycle, there's this square on a car. So what it's showing here is basically the squares which the model detected, and hence it describes the detection, and then it goes through another real net or image net algorithm, and it tries to detect what's in the square. So yeah, we can go ahead. The second application you can see is image matching and retrieval. So given a query image, find similar images in a large database. Basically, can you guys give any other alternative use of this object problem? Like there can be many use of this now. Like where can this problem be applied? Anyone? I'll explain the problem once again. Like if we give an image to a model, it will give the similar images back. So where can this be applied?
For face detection, I guess.
Yeah, correct. Face detection we can say, or we can say sign detection. This problem originated when in banks the signs are there now. So to detect the if the signs are matching or not, this problem was iterative. Like if we gave a sign back, it should output the signs which are already in the dataset, which matches to them. So yeah, we can go ahead. This is how we train this model. So our input image is given as a query, which goes to the set of convolution layer, and there's two more images which we give to train the model. First image we give a relevant image so that the computer can know of what to compare to give it a right image, and the third image also we give of a non-relevant image so that the computer knows like what it doesn't look like and what it does look like. So this is a Siamese network which we are training. There are quite many use of Siamese networks. Like in normal CNN techniques or in normal CNN data exploration, a large amount of data set is needed, like minimum 20,000, 30,000 images are needed. But in SIMS network, you can just train the model by just 3 images. One give query, the second image must be relevant, and the third image must be not relevant. And yeah, you got a pretty nice model working with quite good accuracy. So yeah, we can go ahead. Do you guys anyway doubt of what all just happened? Yeah, Nishant, we can go ahead with further name.
Yeah. So we've included a few resources to learn further. If you're curious about anything that you've learned so far and you have any doubts, and maybe you want to learn more about convolutional neural networks or deep learning in general, we've linked a few helpful resources to go through if you would like to do that. We'll be sharing the PPT, I guess, a bit later. But yeah, I think that's about it. We're open to questions now. If you have any questions, you can feel free to unmute or put it in the chat box and we'll answer your questions. If there are no doubts, I think we can wind down the session here. So thank you so much for everybody who attended.
Nishant,
And if you have any doubts,
one second.
yeah.
Nishant. So yeah, I'd like to add something. So you guys basically saw how deep learning wonderfully does this job of, so in the YOLO video you saw the bounding boxes and recognizing stuff and like whatnot. There's a lot of stuff going on, and but there's actually another side of the coin where like all this cool stuff that you see is actually really easy to fail, and it fails at the situations where you like it seems very silly basically. So there's a whole field called adversarial machine learning. Like if you want to go into it, or like if you want to see okay how all this can fail, yeah, I put in the chat like a short post, and it just gives an overview of what is going on, and it's a pretty like old post, around 3-4 years old, and there's a lot more done into this area of how these models are vulnerable. And it's not just with like deep learning, it's general to like whole of even very simple machine learning linear models that you see. So there's a pretty interesting work going on, and like doing this can help us where our models are actually failing, and work in that direction. So feel free to look more into it. What is adversarial machine learning, what are like the defense mechanisms, and yeah, so you can refer this blog post, or like if you want to look more into it. And yeah, especially this is carried out in like images stuff, so like with respect to convolution neural networks and stuff. So the blog that I have sent implements those attacks in CNNs only. So feel free to check out those. And if you if you're excited to learn more about it, then you can just either like reach out to any of us and like know more about it. Yep.
Yeah, thanks, Vede. If are there any doubts, you could put up in the chat. Otherwise, I think we can include this link as well to the PPT. But if there are no other doubts, I think we can wind down the session here. So thank you so much for attending, everybody. And if you have any doubts, even after the session, you can feel free to reach out to any of us. So yeah, thank you. Have a great day.